Reality is not always terrifying. Sometimes it is just unbearable. Dreadcore does not show monsters chasing you. It shows worlds where reality is quietly replaced by something easier to accept. The horror is not what appears. The horror is what disappears. Dreadcore is not just an aesthetic or a genre. It is a form of psychological horror built around denying reality as a coping mechanism. This analysis explores how Dreadcore turns escapism into avoidance, comfort into distortion, and why refusing reality can become more terrifying than facing it. The fear is not that reality is broken. It is that you choose not to see it. Dreadcore is not defined by a single game, story, or mechanic. It is defined by an experience. Across different horror games that fall under this aesthetic, the player is placed into spaces that feel disconnected from reality, not through fantasy, but through distortion. These worlds resemble reality enough to feel familiar, but behave differently enough to feel wrong. The environments in Dreadcore games often appear quiet, empty, and suspended. Streets stretch too far. Rooms feel abandoned but untouched. Objects exist without purpose. The world does not react the way a living world should. It feels paused, as if time itself has chosen not to move forward. Importantly, these spaces are not chaotic. They are calm. There are no constant threats, no loud dangers, no urgent objectives. The player is not chased. They are allowed to wander. This absence of immediate danger creates a false sense of safety. The world feels peaceful, but that peace feels artificial. The player is usually given minimal instruction. There is no clear goal beyond moving forward, observing, and existing within the space. This lack of direction encourages exploration, but it also removes meaning. Progress becomes ambiguous. The player walks, looks, listens, but rarely acts in a way that changes the world. This is where Dreadcore separates itself from traditional horror. Fear does not come from what happens. It comes from what does not happen. The world does not acknowledge the player in a meaningful way. Doors may open, lights may flicker, sounds may echo, but nothing responds with intent. There is no dialogue guiding the player, no narrative voice explaining events. The environment exists independently of the player's presence. This creates a subtle psychological effect. The player begins to feel unnecessary, not threatened, but irrelevant. Visual design reinforces this feeling. Spaces often look like incomplete versions of reality. Familiar locations appear stripped of context. Schools without students, homes without families, streets without movement. These places feel like memories rather than locations. The player recognizes these spaces but cannot place them. They feel remembered rather than lived in. This ambiguity keeps the player emotionally engaged. They want to understand what they are seeing, even though understanding is never fully offered. Sound design plays a similar role. Audio is often minimal. Ambient noise replaces music. Silence stretches for long periods. When sound does appear, it feels distant or detached, as if coming from somewhere else. This reinforces the sense that the world is disconnected from the present moment. Crucially, Dreadcore does not force interpretation. The player is not told what is real and what is not. There are no explicit explanations. The world simply exists in a state of unresolved uncertainty. This allows the player's mind to fill in gaps. As the player continues, a pattern emerges. These worlds feel like places where reality has been abandoned, not destroyed, but ignored. The rules of the world still exist, but meaning does not. Objects exist, but purpose does not. The player is not trapped in these spaces. They could leave at any time, but the design encourages lingering. Curiosity pulls the player forward. They want to find something that explains why the world feels this way. This is where denial begins to surface. The player wants to believe there is an answer. That clarity exists somewhere ahead. The game never confirms this belief. Instead, it allows the player to remain suspended between recognition and refusal. The world is clearly wrong, but the player continues to engage with it as if it might make sense eventually. Dreadcore games create environments that do not collapse or threaten. They persist. They wait. They offer an alternative to reality that is quieter, emptier, and easier to endure. The minimal context is intentional. By removing explicit narrative and threat, the game removes excuses. The player cannot blame fear or danger for staying. They stay because the world is tolerable, and that tolerance is the foundation of the horror. When players enter a Dreadcore experience, they often expect the horror to reveal itself eventually. Even if the world feels strange, quiet, or incomplete, there is an assumption that something will happen. A threat will appear. A truth will be uncovered. A moment will arrive where the distortion becomes clear. That moment rarely comes. Dreadcore breaks the expectation that horror escalates. Instead of building toward confrontation, it sustains absence. The longer the player remains, the clearer it becomes that the world is not preparing to reveal itself. It is content to remain unresolved. This directly challenges how players are trained to read games. Progress is usually tied to understanding. Exploration leads to answers. Time invested produces clarity. Dreadcore refuses this logic. Time does not reward the player. It only deepens uncertainty. At first, the player believes the emptiness is temporary. They assume the silence exists to contrast with something louder later. They continue forward expecting discovery. This expectation keeps them engaged. But as repetition sets in, the player realizes something unsettling. The environment is not withholding information. There may simply be nothing to reveal. This breaks a core expectation of horror. Fear is not waiting behind the corner. Fear is already present, embedded in the structure of the world. The absence itself is the threat. In traditional horror, the player is pushed away from danger. In Dreadcore, the player is pulled inward. The lack of urgency creates a strange comfort. There is no pressure to escape, no punishment for staying. The world does not react negatively to the player's presence. This creates a psychological inversion. The player expects fear to force them out. Instead, calm keeps them inside. Another expectation collapses when the player realizes that the world does not care whether they understand it. There are no puzzles that clarify meaning, no hidden lore that explains everything. Attempts to interpret the environment feel speculative rather than rewarding. This frustrates the player's desire for resolution. Humans are conditioned to seek coherence. When coherence is denied, the mind fills the gap. The player begins to project meaning onto the space. This projection is where denial begins to form. Rather than accepting that the world may be empty or broken, the player continues searching for logic. They believe there must be an explanation. This belief allows them to stay engaged without confronting the possibility that reality has already been abandoned. Dreadcore breaks the expectation that horror is active. It shows that horror can be passive. The world does not chase you. It waits. And waiting is more effective than pursuit. The player also expects that discomfort will eventually force a decision. Leave or confront. But the discomfort never peaks. It remains steady, manageable. This encourages endurance rather than action. Over time, the player adapts. The strange becomes familiar. The silence becomes normal. The distorted reality becomes accepted. This adaptation is crucial. The player no longer reacts to the world as wrong. They begin to exist within it. This is the most significant expectation break. Horror is supposed to disrupt. Dreadcore normalizes disruption instead. By denying escalation, the experience removes the player's usual exit strategies. There is no climax to wait for, no resolution to reach. The only option is acceptance or disengagement. Many players choose acceptance. This choice is not framed as surrender. It feels like patience, like understanding will come later. The player tells themselves they just need more time. Dreadcore uses this expectation against the player. The belief that meaning will eventually appear keeps them inside a reality that has already lost it. By the time the player realizes that nothing is coming, they have already adapted to a world without explanation. Reality has been quietly replaced by tolerance. The expectation that horror announces itself loudly is gone. What remains is a softer realization. Horror does not always attack. Sometimes it waits for you to stop expecting more. And once expectation disappears, denial no longer feels like avoidance. It feels like peace. Reality denial is not a dramatic psychological collapse. It is rarely loud, chaotic, or sudden. In most cases, it is gradual, quiet, and functional. People do not deny reality because they are incapable of understanding it. They deny it because accepting it feels unbearable. Dreadcore builds its horror directly on this mechanism. In psychology, denial is a defense mechanism. It allows the mind to avoid confronting information that creates emotional distress. Rather than processing pain, the individual unconsciously rejects the reality that causes it. This does not remove the problem. It simply removes awareness. Dreadcore environments reflect this process visually and structurally. The worlds are not destroyed. They are incomplete. They resemble reality enough to feel recognizable, but lack the elements that make reality demanding. There are no social obligations, no consequences, no urgency. These spaces feel easier to exist in. The player is not overwhelmed. They are relieved. The quietness, the emptiness, and the lack of expectation offer emotional distance from reality. The world asks nothing of the player except presence. This mirrors denial in real life. Denial does not create comfort through pleasure. It creates comfort through absence. What makes Dreadcore effective is that it does not frame denial as error. It frames it as coping. The player is not punished for staying in these spaces. They are not told they are wrong. The game allows denial to feel reasonable. In real psychological denial, individuals often function normally. They go to work, they socialize, they make decisions, but certain truths are quietly excluded from awareness. Dreadcore replicates this by allowing the player to move forward without ever confronting meaning. The game does not lie to the player. It simply does not confirm reality. The absence of confirmation allows the player to choose interpretation. This choice is critical. Denial only works when it feels voluntary. The player senses that something is missing, but they are never forced to articulate what it is. This allows them to continue engaging without emotional rupture. The environment supports this by remaining stable. Nothing escalates. Nothing demands resolution. Reality denial becomes sustainable. Dreadcore also removes social reference points. There are no other people reacting to the world, no voices questioning what is happening. This isolation mirrors how denial deepens when individuals lack external perspective. Without contradiction, belief becomes insulated. The player expects that reality will eventually assert itself, that something will break the illusion. But Dreadcore denies this expectation. The world does not correct itself. It remains distorted. This is psychologically accurate. Denial persists until reality forces confrontation. In the game, reality never forces anything. The player is allowed to remain suspended indefinitely. Over time, the player adapts to this suspension. The absence of meaning becomes normal. The player no longer searches urgently. Curiosity fades into routine. This adaptation is the true horror. Denial is not terrifying because it hides truth. It is terrifying because it works. The validated theme here is not escapism as fantasy, but escapism as avoidance. The player does not escape into something better. They escape into something quieter. Dreadcore shows how denial can feel like relief. Reality is heavy. It demands engagement, responsibility, and response. Denial offers stillness. The game does not frame this stillness as wrong. It allows the player to feel its appeal. This honesty is what makes it disturbing. By the time the player recognizes that the world represents a rejected reality, they are already comfortable inside it. Leaving would require effort. Re-engaging with reality would require loss. Dreadcore does not force the player to deny reality. It invites them to rest from it, and that invitation is what makes denial so difficult to refuse. Comfort is rarely seen as dangerous. It is usually framed as healing, rest, or safety. But in Dreadcore, comfort is not a reward. It is a tool. The worlds created by Dreadcore are not designed to frighten the player into awareness. They are designed to soothe the player into staying. This is where denial becomes sustainable. The environments in Dreadcore are calm by design. Lighting is soft. Sounds are distant. Movement is slow. Nothing rushes the player. Nothing demands reaction. The absence of threat creates emotional relief. Compared to reality, which constantly asks for decisions and responsibility, these spaces feel forgiving. Comfort lowers resistance. When a space feels comfortable, the mind stops questioning it. The player does not feel the need to analyze or challenge the environment. They simply exist within it. This is how denial operates psychologically. It does not confront reality. It replaces it with something less demanding. Dreadcore understands that fear does not need to be intense to be effective. Low-level discomfort mixed with high-level comfort creates a balance where the player can tolerate unease without acting on it. The world feels wrong, but not wrong enough to reject. This mirrors real-life denial. People rarely deny reality by immersing themselves in extreme fantasy. They deny it through routine, distraction, and small comforts. Familiar spaces, repetitive behaviors, predictable environments. Dreadcore spaces feel familiar without being specific. They resemble places the player recognizes, but stripped of personal consequence. This familiarity makes comfort feel earned. The player feels at home, even though the space is incomplete. Sound design reinforces this effect. Ambient noise replaces silence, but never overwhelms. The player is not left alone with their thoughts, but they are also not stimulated enough to engage deeply. This creates a mental state similar to dissociation. The player drifts. This drifting is critical. When the mind drifts, it stops processing conflict. Reality requires attention. Denial thrives when attention fades. The game never asks the player to confront what is missing. It allows the absence to exist quietly. Comfort becomes a buffer between the player and awareness. The longer the player stays, the more effort it would take to leave. This creates a subtle dependency. The player is not addicted to pleasure. They are attached to relief. Dreadcore also removes friction. There are no failure states that push the player out. No consequences that demand re-engagement. The world accepts the player's presence without condition. This unconditional acceptance contrasts sharply with reality, where acceptance is often tied to performance or behavior. Comfort becomes an argument. Why return to a world that demands when this one allows? The horror emerges when the player realizes that comfort has replaced meaning. The world feels safe but empty, peaceful but stagnant. The player is not growing, discovering, or resolving anything. They are simply remaining. This is the psychological cost of denial. Comfort prevents collapse, but it also prevents change. Dreadcore does not frame this as evil. It allows the player to feel the appeal. That honesty is what makes it unsettling. The player understands why someone might choose this state. The game quietly asks a difficult question. How much comfort is too much? At what point does relief become avoidance? The player is never forced to answer. The environment continues to offer the same gentle stillness. The choice to leave remains available, but emotionally difficult. Comfort, once established, becomes inertia. Dreadcore uses this inertia to sustain denial. The player stays not because they are trapped, but because moving feels unnecessary. And when reality feels heavier than emptiness, denial stops feeling like escape. It starts feeling like home. This is where Dreadcore moves beyond atmosphere and becomes existential. Denial does not only distort reality. Over time, it erodes identity. When a person remains in a space that asks nothing of them, they slowly lose the parts of themselves that exist to respond, decide, and act. Dreadcore environments do not reflect who the player is. They do not challenge values, preferences, or goals. The world does not ask the player to define themselves. In doing so, it creates a space where identity becomes unnecessary. Identity is shaped through friction, through resistance, conflict, and consequence. Reality forces people to choose, to commit, to fail, and to adapt. Denial removes these pressures. In a Dreadcore world, there is no need to assert identity because nothing requires response. At first, this feels peaceful. The player enjoys the absence of expectation. There is no role to perform, no standard to meet. But over time, this absence creates emptiness. Without demand, identity has nothing to push against. The player begins to feel less like an individual and more like an observer. They move through spaces without purpose. Their presence does not matter. The world exists whether they engage or not. This detachment mirrors dissociative states, where individuals feel separated from themselves and their environment. Dreadcore captures this dissociation without naming it. The player feels distant, not only from the world, but from their own agency. Actions feel optional. Decisions feel inconsequential. Identity begins to fade into passivity. This erosion is subtle. There is no moment where the player realizes they have lost themselves. It happens gradually, through repetition. The longer the player remains, the less they expect from themselves. The compound effect emerges here. Denial creates comfort. Comfort removes friction. The absence of friction erodes identity. The game never tells the player who they are. It never forces self-reflection. It allows the player to exist without definition. This may feel freeing at first, but it becomes destabilizing over time. Humans need context to maintain identity. Without contrast, self-awareness dissolves. Dreadcore worlds remove contrast entirely. Everything feels evenly muted. The emotional range narrows. The player is not distressed, but they are not fulfilled either. This narrowing is dangerous because it feels sustainable. The player can remain in this state indefinitely. There is no crisis forcing change. Identity erosion does not cause pain immediately. It causes numbness. Numbness is easier to tolerate than pain. That is why denial persists. The horror emerges when the player recognizes that nothing is forming inside them. Time passes, but nothing accumulates. Experience does not lead to growth. The self remains static. Dreadcore does not show identity being taken away. It shows identity being left behind. The player could reclaim it by re-engaging with reality, but that would require accepting discomfort, responsibility, uncertainty. The cost feels high compared to the ease of staying. This mirrors real psychological avoidance. People do not lose themselves because they want to. They lose themselves because maintaining identity requires effort. The game does not frame this erosion as tragedy. It allows it to feel normal, and that normalization is the true horror. By combining denial with identity erosion, Dreadcore exposes a quiet danger. Avoiding reality does not just remove pain, it removes definition. The player is left with a question that has no clear answer. If a world asks nothing of you, who are you inside it? And if leaving that world feels too heavy, what does that say about what has already been lost? Dreadcore does not end with revelation. It does not pull the curtain back and explain what the world really is. There is no final truth waiting to be uncovered. The experience ends the same way it unfolds, quietly, unresolved and suspended. This is intentional. Dreadcore understands that denial does not collapse on its own. It fades into habit. People do not wake up one day and realize they have been denying reality. They simply realize much later that they have been absent from it. By the time the player reaches the end of a Dreadcore experience, nothing dramatic has happened. There was no monster to defeat, no escape to earn, no clarity to claim. The world remains intact, calm, and distant, and so does the player. The discomfort comes from recognizing what is missing. The player notices that time was spent, but nothing was resolved. Movement occurred, but nothing changed. Presence was maintained, but nothing was demanded. The experience offered rest without restoration. This mirrors how denial functions outside of games. Denial does not explode. It settles. It becomes routine. Days pass. Life continues. But something essential is postponed indefinitely. Dreadcore leaves the player with that postponement. The horror is not that the world was unreal. The horror is that it was preferable. The player understands why someone would choose it, why someone would remain in a place that does not ask them to confront anything painful. The game never condemns this choice. It allows the player to feel its logic. And that is what makes the ending uncomfortable. The player cannot easily dismiss the experience as fantasy. It reflects something real. The realization arrives slowly. Denying reality does not destroy the world. It slowly removes your place within it. Dreadcore shows that when you stop responding to reality, reality does not chase you. It moves on without you. Identity erodes quietly. Purpose dissolves gently. The self fades through neglect, not violence. The player is left without instruction on what to do next. There is no moral lesson delivered, no warning issued, just an open space where reflection settles. At some point, the player must decide whether to return to a world that demands something of them or remain in one that does not. The game does not judge either choice. It simply shows the cost. Reality is heavy because it requires engagement. Denial is light because it requires nothing. Dreadcore exposes how seductive that lightness can be. The final discomfort comes from a simple question that lingers long after the screen fades. At what point does rest become avoidance? At what point does comfort become disappearance? If this kind of analysis resonates with you, if you are drawn to horror that examines avoidance, identity, and the cost of refusing reality, consider subscribing to the channel. Here, horror is not about what attacks us, but about what we quietly step away from.